Okay, welcome back to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
This is where we really roll up our sleeves, grab the sources you send us, and just dig in.
Yep, the mission is always to pull out those key insights, the important bits, so you get the core information without wading through everything yourself.
Exactly. Help you get informed, maybe see things in a new light. Today, we're tackling a pretty big claim, one you hear quite a bit in science and faith discussions.
Right, the idea that the Bible actually predicted the Big Bang.
Yeah, it pops up. I remember Dinesh D'Souza brought it up against Alex O'Connor's. And O'Connor's, well, he pushed back pretty hard on that.
It's definitely a recurring theme. And for this deep dive, we're focusing on one specific critique, an article by Jorge Pires, a PhD.
What's the title?
It's called, Does the Bible Predict the Big Bang? A critical look at John Lennox's argument.
Okay, so Lennox is the proponent here, and Pires is offering the critique.
That's the setup. Pires is examining the arguments Lennox makes for this Bible predicts Big Bang idea.
Got it. So our goal today is to unpack Pires' critique. We'll look at his main points, the counter-arguments he lays out in this article.
And really try to distill what this particular source, Pires' article, wants you to understand about this whole claim.
All right, let's dive in. Where does Pires start?
Well, he starts by outlining the core claim from Lennox as presented in the article. Lennox basically argues Genesis offers this brilliant prediction.
The prediction being?
That the universe had a beginning, something that modern cosmology, the Big Bang theory, only confirmed much, much later.
Okay, so that's the basic idea.
But Pires notes Lennox takes it a step further. He suggests this means science should, pay more attention to the Bible.
Implying there are other hidden scientific gems in there.
That seems to be the implication Pires is addressing, yes, that Scripture could be a source for scientific insights.
Interesting. How does Pires respond to that?
He immediately brings up a pretty major counterexample, someone often cited by people making Lennox's type of argument, Sir Isaac Newton.
Newton, the giant of science, deeply religious.
Exactly. But Pires digs into Newton's specific religious views, pointing out they were, unconventional for the time. He denied the Trinity, didn't see Christ as divine, saw God more as this abstract intelligence, almost deistic, really.
Okay, so not standard Christian orthodoxy. But didn't Newton study the Bible intensely?
He did, especially later in life. Pires highlights this. Newton became absolutely obsessed with it.
Obsessed how?
He was convinced it contained hidden codes, prophecies, timelines for the end times, even scientific data like the dimensions of the universe. He poured enormous effort into it.
So the ultimate Bible code guy, in a way.
Yeah.
But with a genius IQ.
You could put it that way. And Pires asks the crucial question, what scientific breakthroughs came from all that intense biblical study by Newton?
Let me guess.
According to Pires, zero. Absolutely nothing. No enduring scientific theories, no testable hypotheses, nothing that advanced science.
Wow. So the guy who basically invented classical physics found no physics in the Bible despite looking really hard.
That's precisely the point Pires makes. He doesn't frame it as a footnote. He calls it a devastating refutation of the whole method.
The method being trying to extract scientific knowledge from Scripture.
Right. Pires' argument, as presented, is, if Isaac Newton, with all his genius and dedication, failed completely at this, why should we think modern science would succeed by going back to the Bible for scientific predictions?
That's a strong point. It really challenges the premise.
It does. And it leads Pires naturally into looking at the bigger picture, the history. What about the argument that Christianity itself was foundational for modern science? Because guys like Newton, Kepler, Boyle, they were Christians.
Yeah, you hear that a lot. Science emerged from a Christian worldview, etc.
Pires tackles this head-on. He says, sure, they were Christians, biographically speaking, but he argues it's a mistake, even historically dishonest, to then say Christianity caused modern science, or that the Bible was its blueprint.
He's saying correlation isn't causation, basically. Their personal faith versus the source of their scientific method.
Exactly. He's separating the person's belief from their scientific epistemology, how they actually gained knowledge about the world.
So what does Pires say did happen during the centuries when Christianity was dominant in Europe, before the scientific revolution really kicked off?
Well, the article poses a rather pointed question. What did 2,000 years of quote-unquote Christian science actually produce in terms of testable knowledge about nature?
Ouch. What's his answer?
He lists things like alchemy, astrology, demonology, and significantly the persecution of dissenters. Not exactly a hotbed of empirical discovery.
So his perspective is that the scientific breakthroughs came despite the prevailing religious climate, not because of it.
That's the argument Pires puts forward. He suggests these thinkers used reason, observation, math tools, often inherited from Greek philosophy, actually, and sometimes did so in fear of religious institutions.
He gives examples.
Yeah, he mentions the case of a priest who was secretly an atheist, fearing the consequences if revealed. Pires' point is stark. Newton didn't find gravity in Genesis. Kepler didn't find elliptical orbits in the Gospels.
Their discoveries came from looking at the world, at the data.
Through observation and mathematics, not through scriptural interpretation, according to Pires.
This leads into another area Pires examines, right? The idea of religious suppression of science.
Yes, he critiques what he sees as Lennox's tendency to downplay this, often using the Galileo case.
Who's so? What's Lennox's angle, according to Pires?
Pires notes that Lennox sometimes emphasizes that Galileo's initial opposition came from academic rivals, not the church itself.
Okay, a point of historical detail.
But Pires argues this is ultimately a distraction. The real issue, he insists, is what the church did when it got involved.
Which was?
Silencing him, censoring his work, confining him literal house arrest.
And Pires takes issue with how this is sometimes framed.
Strongly. He criticizes describing it as just house arrest and pointing out Galileo had some comforts. Pires calls this kind of framing bad history and even a subtle form of gaslighting.
Gaslighting, that's a strong term.
His point is that focusing on the relative comfort obscures the fundamental injustice. Comfortable tyranny is still tyranny.
It was punishment for his ideas, for his scientific conclusions.
Exactly. Pires argues it's the principle of suppressing thought that matters, drawing parallels to modern authoritarian regimes. Ideas need freedom, he insists, not fancy accommodations during censorship.
So minimizing the church's role, or the severity based on comfort, is missing the point, in Pires' view.
That's his argument. Freedom of inquiry was denied, and that's the core issue.
And does Pires see this suppression as purely historical?
No, he argues this pattern didn't just vanish. He suggests it transitioned into more modern, maybe subtler forms.
Like what? Does he give examples?
He does. He mentions the Nobel laureate José Saramago. Apparently, his novel faced being blacklisted from an international prize because the Portuguese government felt pressure from the Catholic Church over its content.
Wow. Okay, so political and institutional pressure.
Right. And he also brings up Bertrand Russell, the famous philosopher and mathematician. His appointment as a professor in New York was actually blocked by a court.
Why?
Because of his outspoken atheism and his criticisms of Christianity, his views were deemed morally unsuitable by opponents.
So, Pires sees a line from Galileo's house arrest to these kinds of modern pressures.
He frames it as a shift from hard censorship, like burning books or imprisonment, to soft suppression.
Meaning things like
institutional pressure, disinvitations, public campaigns to discredit someone, being excluded from platforms or funding. The tools are different, Pires argues, but the goal can still be to contain ideas that challenge religious dogma.
And he feels Lennox doesn't acknowledge this modern aspect.
Pires observes that Lennox, while championing Christianity's compatibility with reason, doesn't seem to apply the same critical scrutiny to these contemporary instances of religious interference in intellectual life.
So the takeaway from Pires on this point is that suppression might look different now, maybe more polite, but it's still a reality.
Yes, that's the essence of his argument here. It hasn't gone away, it's just changed its appearance.
Okay, let's shift back to the specific claim about the Big Bang. How does Pires directly address Lennox's argument that in the beginning, in Genesis, is a scientific prediction?
He flatly rejects that framing. Pires argues it's not a scientific prediction in any meaningful sense.
Why not?
Well, first, he sees it as a metaphysical or theological statement about origins, not something derived from a scientific method. There's no underlying calculation, no observation leading to it.
It's just an assertion.
Pretty much. And he points out, echoing Richard Dawkins in a debate Pires references, that saying the universe either had a beginning or it didn't is basically a 50-50 guess. Getting a coin toss right isn't scientifically impressive.
Especially, Pires adds, when that correct guess comes alongside things in the same text that are scientifically wrong.
Exactly. Pires lists examples like the firmament, the solid dome holding up the waters, plants appearing before the sun, the contradictory creation sequences in Genesis 1 and 2.
And the whole underlying cosmology, which scholars identify as reflecting ancient Near Eastern views, like a flat Earth covered by a dome.
Right. Pires argues you can't just pick the one line that sounds vaguely right after the fact and call it brilliant science, while ignoring all the parts that are clearly wrong by modern standards.
This is what he calls cherry picking.
Yes, or cherry picking with a halo, as he puts it. It's highlighting the apparent hits and explaining away the misses as metaphor or allegory. Pires says that's not how science works. It's confirmation bias applied to scripture.
What about the argument concerning our ability to even do science? Lennox, drawing on Plantinga, sometimes argues that if our minds are just products of unguided evolution, we can't really trust them to find truth.
Right, the evolutionary argument against naturalism, Pires engages with this too.
And his counter.
He makes a few points. First, evolution does select for adaptive behavior, and being able to accurately perceive and reason about your environment track truth essentially is generally very adaptive for survival.
So evolution would favor reliable cognition up to a point.
That's the idea. Second, science as a process has built-in correctives. Things like peer review, the demand for replication, mathematical modeling, they're all designed precisely to catch and correct our individual cognitive biases and errors.
And the third point.
Pires suggests the sheer success of science, its ability to explain, predict, and manipulate the natural world with incredible accuracy, is itself strong empirical evidence that our evolved cognitive faculties are reliable enough for the task.
He basically says, look, it works.
Pretty much. And he adds that the argument from divine origin doesn't really explain how that guarantees reliability any better. It just asserts it.
Okay, another area Pires pushes back on is the historical claim that science really begins with Christianity, or needs belief in a rational creator.
Yes, he challenges this narrative directly.
By pointing to pre-Christian science.
Exactly. He brings up examples from ancient Greece and Hellenistic Egypt. Eratosthenes calculating Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy.
Aristarchus proposing a heliocentric model millennia before Copernicus.
Pythagoras, Anaximander seeking natural explanations. Hypatia in Alexandria, possibly working on elliptical orbits.
So the foundations were laid much earlier, drawing on different philosophical traditions.
That's Pires' argument. He suggests science builds on that Greek commitment to logos, reason, order, and empirical investigation. It survived through periods of theological suppression, he argues, rather than being birthed by it.
He contrasts it with other historical periods.
He briefly mentions the Islamic Golden Age, acknowledging its brilliance, but suggests its scientific momentum slowed when theological dogma gained precedence over free inquiry, offering it as a parallel dynamic.
Interesting comparison. Finally, Pires critiques Lennox's framing of the whole thing as a clash of worldviews.
Yeah, the idea that it's just Christian theism versus atheistic naturalism presented as two competing belief systems on equal footing.
Pires disagrees with that framing.
He does. He argues that science isn't a worldview in the same sense that theology is. It's fundamentally a method.
A method based on what?
On principles like falsifiability, the idea that a scientific claim must be testable and capable of being proven wrong by evidence, on predictive power, on empirical testing, on self-correction.
And theology doesn't operate by those same rules.
Not in the same way, according to Pires. He contrasts science's evolution-changing theories based on new evidence, admitting errors with what he sees as theology often doing, which is reinterpreting ancient texts after science makes a discovery to make the text fit.
The retrofitting he mentioned earlier.
Exactly. So Pires argues that framing it simply as dueling worldviews hides a crucial asymmetry in how they generate knowledge about the natural world. Not all approaches are equally effective or reliable for that specific task.
So, wrapping up Pires' overall critique,
Right.
How does he summarize the issue with trying to find science in the Bible?
He sees the method Lennox employs, as Pires presents it, as being fundamentally rhetorical, not scientific. It's borrowing the language and prestige of science, talking about predictions, mechanisms, reason, but applying it to theology without adopting science's rigorous standards and self-critical attitude.
The asymmetric standards, again, celebrating hits, explaining away misses.
Right. He calls it confirmation theology, or post hoc retrofitting. Basically, finding confirmation for what you already believe, or making the text fit after the fact.
And Pires' bottom line.
It's pretty blunt. The Bible isn't a science textbook. Whatever its value as literature, mythology, cultural heritage, which could be immense, it's not, in his view, a source of predictive scientific insight.
And trying to make it one is problematic.
Pires argues it risks tying science to dogma, which historically hasn't ended well for science.
And he loops back to Newton at the end.
Yes, Newton serves as his ultimate cautionary tale. The brilliant scientist whose attempts to extract science from Scripture were completely fruitless. Pires sees that failure as a historical lesson against the idea that revelation provides a shortcut to understanding nature.
So what does science need, according to Pires?
Not the Bible, he argues. It needs doubt, it needs evidence, and it needs the freedom to follow that evidence wherever it leads, no matter how uncomfortable the conclusions might be for existing beliefs.
And his final verdict on Lennox's arguments is presented in the article.
He describes them as built on a foundation of rhetorical sleight of hand, philosophical presumption, and selective literalism.
Oof. Strong words.
Very. And he ends with that striking metaphor. Science might have grown up in a religious household, metaphorically speaking, but it left home a long time ago and hasn't looked back.
Okay, so that's a pretty thorough overview of the critique laid out in Pires' article. We've looked at the arguments against finding the Big Bang in Genesis, the use of historical figures like Newton and Galileo,
The discussion about Christian Science, the history of suppression, both old and new, and the direct challenges to specific claims about cognitive reliability and worldview framing.
and the core takeaway from this source, from Pires, is clearly that the Bible shouldn't be treated as a scientific text, and attempts to do so involve, in his view, flawed reasoning like cherry-picking and retrofitting.
That's the central message of the article we examined today.
We hope this deep dive into Pires' perspective has given you a clearer picture of one detailed critique of this common claim.
Definitely. And perhaps something for you to think about further. How do we actually distinguish between someone's personal beliefs, the historical context they lived in, and the specific method needed for scientific discovery?
That's a great question. And building on that, what does the history Pires outlines the interactions between science and religious institutions suggest about the conditions necessary for science to really thrive? What does genuine intellectual freedom look like in practice?
Lots to chew on there.
Indeed. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.